You are listening to the SDSU podcast presented by the East Village Times with your hosts Andre Hagberdian and Paul Garrison. Welcome, listeners, back to the SDSU podcast. This is your host Andre Hagberdian. We'll be joined shortly by my co-host Paul Garrison. Today's episode is number 135 and includes an interview with the new offensive line coach of San Diego State, Mike Schmidt. He's a familiar name as someone who coached here for 9 years before departing in 2020 to go coach at Syracuse for a couple of years and then off to Mississippi State last year before making his way back to San Diego State. He is a local San Diegan, played at Madison High School before coming to San Diego State. It was a great interview to get an insight into how he looks at the offensive line position as a coach. How he develops, what kind of players he looks for when he's recruiting offensive line, and just the overall, rationale and reasoning for wanting to come back and associate himself with this new coaching staff with Sean Lewis. Paul and I will be back afterwards to give you some of our takeaways, and then at the end we will give you a quick rundown of the players that have come in from the transfer portal post spring. There's 8 commits currently as we sit here today. 8 guys that the staff, has highlighted and hopes can make a difference on both the offensive and defensive side. There is 1 scholarship left. Then we'll talk a little bit about who we think that could go to or what position that will go to. Let's get to the interview with Coach Schmidt. We want to welcome Mike Schmidt, San Diego State's offensive line coach, to the podcast. How are you doing today, Coach?
I'm doing great. How you guys doing?
Very well, thank you.
Pretty good. I believe it was your birthday a couple of days ago. Is that right?
Yeah, it was last Friday. 37 years old.
Happy belated birthday. You've had a whirlwind of the last couple months. How did this opportunity at San Diego State come about? And, were you close to taking a job somewhere else before this came about?
Yeah, it came up. I was in talks with Coach Lewis. We got let go at Mississippi State. Kind of unfortunate situation there. And right when this job opened up, Coach Lewis got it, and I was in talks with him and kind of knew, what could happen, and everything kind of played out. And it's an unbelievable opportunity to come back and work for my first offensive coach, which is a step in my career as well. I've been working with defensive guys my whole career. So it just worked out perfect, and get to get the family home, and everything's been great.
With all, potential other opportunities that could be out there, why was Sean Lewis someone that you wanted to work for and with?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at it, because you're looking at it from, there's the home team and those kinds of things. But at the same time, we got 2 little kids at home, and it is about setting them up for success. And my whole thing, when we got let go, it's the first time in 12 years that I had been let go in this profession. And you start looking at your family, and really to be, sustained as an offensive line coach in this profession, you got to have that relationship with the offensive coordinator that really believes in you, and you kind of tie your hip to. And that was a huge reason why it was such an easy decision to come home working for Coach Lewis.
But you mentioned a second ago that this is the first time that you're going to be working for an offensive-minded head coach. Why is that? Why does that matter?
It really matters for the future of your career, right? Because, now Zach Arnett, the guy who had previously been here, he got the head job at Mississippi State. He brought me down there. And then there's only certain times where those defensive guys can really pull the strings to get that done for an offensive coach, where you watch how offensive line coaches are getting hired throughout this profession. And it's really a lot of coaches are really tied to an offensive coordinator. So I think that was an easy decision to get tied up with a guy so successful like Coach Lewis, and having the same relationships with those guys that we met together out at Syracuse, and I think a lot of those guys vouched for me, which made it an easy decision for him when O'Boyle left.
And now, when you're looking for an offensive lineman, what in general, not specifically about the kids that are there now, but what is it that you're mostly looking for?
Yeah, I refer to it as the 4Fs, right? Do they have the frame to play at this level? Do they have the feet to play at this level, the flexibility, and then do they finish plays? So really the 4Fs is kind of the way I categorize the evaluation. And there's a sliding scale in there, but just breaking it down in those categories so I keep my evaluations organized is probably the biggest benefit to myself.
Where did those 4Fs develop from?
Just from, when I was a young coach, I'd be looking at a recruit and I'd say, I'd have a bunch of different comments about one guy. And then I'd look at another one and I'd be all over the place on a whole different set of criteria. So then I kind of came up with myself to really organize my thoughts and then have a scale to be able to rank these recruits, so we can evaluate them, number one, because I mean, just like we've had in the past here, the previous 9 years I was a line coach here, it's getting those guys that you really feel like you can develop with potential and then believing in the program to get that potential out of them.
And then watching, little tape of Kent State and things like that, it seemed like Sean Lewis's offense had a lot of pulling components to it. What does a lineman do in the system that you guys are building?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets labeled as an up-tempo spread offense, and that is what we are. But the unique thing about this spread offense is you're not dropping back 70 times a game, right? Everything that they're asking those guys to do on Sunday, we are asking them to do here. So they are being trained the same fundamentals and techniques that are going to translate to that next level. So really, all the schemes you're seeing at the next level, besides some fullback lead schemes that we used to major in here, are going to be highlighted in this offense.
When we saw Coach Lewis get hired and bring in his offense, there were 3 starters from last year's offensive line that transferred out, and all 3 ended up at Power 5 schools. And the thought process was that Sean Lewis is going to look for different types of offensive line. It was a pro style offense last year. Those guys maybe would not fit. But from what we're hearing and what you're talking about, it doesn't necessarily look like you need to go out and recruit a completely different type of offensive lineman to fit the system. Is that accurate?
No, I think all offensive linemen come in different shapes and sizes. And I really believe that your program and the way you practice is going to get them in shape to run that offense. But every offensive lineman has strengths and weaknesses. And it's my job as a coach to highlight those strengths, let him know the ways that he can overcome those limitations. And that's how you develop an offensive lineman. I don't think any offense fits a certain style of lineman. I do know, like, a guy like that we've had in the past, like Billy Dunkel, who was a big old mauler guard, would, he might have had to lose another 10, 15 pounds to deal with the tempo. But those same guys we had here that made us so successful those years, we would take those same guys again. And we're trying to get back to that here on the recruiting trail right now.
How do you typically like to build a line? Are there positions like center or left tackle that once you find that, then you build the rest around them, or how do you go about trying to find your 5 guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a perfect scenario, yeah, you want to start inside out and with that center position and all that. Right now, we're kind of piecing it together a little bit. So finding that center and trying to hone in on that guy to kind of lead the group, with all the communication he has to do, I think that kind of sets the table for everything. But we're piecing stuff together. We gotta continue to develop every position. One thing I would say when you are building a unit is to try to develop that versatility to where, as a coach, you're not handcuffed getting the best 5 guys on the field. So you got to have some position flexibility in order to do that. So right now we've kind of left guys this spring in the one spot so far, but as we get going here toward the back half, we're going to start moving guys around to develop some of that flexibility so we aren't so handcuffed on who can play where.
From a coaching practice, you've obviously you played offensive line, you've coached. Who are some of the chief influences on your coaching practice, and what are the things you learned from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes from really, I was really lucky coming up, whether it was a graduate assistant here or or getting my first shot as a position coach. You know, we had some really good offensive coordinators that kind of led me in the right direction when I was a young coach. We had Bob Toledo to start, or we had Al Borges to start. We had Bob Toledo. We had Andy Ludwig. We had Jeff Horton. So those guys kind of laid the groundwork to me. And then more from like an offensive line perspective, I leaned on guys like Tim Drevno out here on the West Coast. And then guys like Hank Fraley, who was at USD the same time I was here at San Diego State. He was always kind to get over here, and we would always play together. So those are kind of the influences, but really the coordinators that I've had the chance to work through really taught me the game from the inside out.
Is there anything off the top of your head that, those guys that you just listed instilled in you that you're still working on and using in your craft today?
Yeah. I think the one guy that stands out to me is Andy Ludwig, who's the OC at Utah. He gave me my first chance. So I was 24 years old when he went into Coach Long's office and said, "This guy's ready." And at the time, I probably wasn't ready, but I learned so much stuff just from organization and evaluation and all that. Like there's so much from him, and even to this day, he's so generous. And if I have any questions, I reach out to him, and he kind of leads me in the right direction.
That's impressive, man. Coach Lewis, one of the things that he's talked about is that the offense can only go as fast as the offensive line. And truth be told, when I heard that, you just kind of shake your head, okay, yes, and smile like you understand it. But I have no idea why that is and what that means. Could you explain, what does it mean that the offensive linemen are really the ones that dictate the tempo? And I guess how you develop that so they could go as fast as, the head coach wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that starts obviously the easy answer is the conditioning part of everything, right? Being able to get back up on the line, push the pace on a defense. But when it comes down to the play, to me, it's the speed of information, right? The speed of information is going to lead any organization in the right way. And if you have good speed of information, that's speed in the meeting room from the coach to the player. And then how fast can they translate that information they get from the quarterback to identify the front, get everybody on the same page and roll is probably the most critical part to tempo.
So the idea is that, you're not huddling. Just I'm going to understand this right. You're not huddling. They get the signal. The QB gets the signal from the sideline, is going to call out the coverage. They're going to have to identify who, whatever the key is that they're reading for that part to then be able to set it up and to go from there.
Yes, sir. So it's really that speed of information. When they get the call from the quarterback, how fast can we get that done? So we're set, ready, feet in the ground, ready for the cadence and ready to roll off the football.
And if we're looking back, we interview again, which we like to do this every year, to get those, touch-ups and things like that with the staff. So hopefully we're doing this again in 2025. But if we're reflecting on 2024 and you're able to say, man, I had a great 2024. What is it that you would have done?
Reframe that question one more time.
Sure. What would make you do a great job for this upcoming year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's building confidence in the group. And I really believe that getting back to running the football at great efficiency here at San Diego State is going to be a huge key, because it is going to be hard in this league to sit back and drop back all those times with the rushers that we have to go against. So being able to be a balanced attack, and that all starts from being able to threaten defenses with the run. I also think that being able to run the football is going to be key to create matchups on the outside. So I think that is the number one thing. Obviously, we're putting good emphasis on protecting the passer too, but being able to run the football, come off at the right pad level, be able to drive our knees on contact, create space, and give the backs a little more air than what they're used to.
We had a chance to talk to Coach Goff several times over the last few years, and he, from his development, he put guys in the NFL. He put guys that left from last year's team, as we talked about, and went to Power 5 schools. But the running game struggled. And his point was that it's a collective. All 5 guys have to be tied together and have to be on the same page. If there's one weak link, that's going to cause the offensive line to not perform well. Is that similar to how you perceive kind of how the offensive line needs to function?
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to be tied together, no doubt. Now, a lot of those guys, were guys that I had recruited and developed that went on to that next level, and like Josh Simmons over there at Ohio State, and some of those guys went on. But being tied together is critical. I think those years where we had a lot of success. You know, you look across, like we were in there watching film with recruits, and you look across, and there's 4 to 5, you know, guys who went on and played at that next level, and we are trying to recruit at that standard again. You know, so we got some work to do, but that all starts from the inside out in the offensive line, right? The speed of information from a coach to a player, from a player to a player, right? And if we can get that down pat, we will give ourselves a chance. Because the first thing you got to do, if you're on the same page, you're giving yourself a chance, right? You might lose a couple physical battles and all that, but you're going to win more just from being on the same page, knowing what the guy next to you is doing, and all that.
Every coach that we talk to has a coaching philosophy. What would you say is yours?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's first of all getting the players to know what to do, right? And we've talked through that a lot today, right? But then getting them to do it in the right way, like right, we talk about their techniques, right? Like taking the proper pass set, taking the right footwork, understanding your leverage. Like that's knowing how to get that job done. But most importantly, what we're going to preach in this room is intent over everything. Like, how are you getting that job done, right? Like everybody is going through the same installs as us across college football. They're installing inside zone, probably very similar to the way we still install inside zone. They're installing the counter play, very similar. But that's not what's important. What's important is how you're doing that activity. And just like when our guys work out in the weight room and stuff, it's like everybody gets so many hours to work out every year, but that ain't going to separate you just going in there and working out. It's how you're doing that activity. And I take that personal as a coach too. It's not how I go. It's not what I go talk about. It's how I get that done, how I get that translated to the young men so they can go out there and put their best foot forward.
You know, you mentioned earlier you come back home, you're a San Diego guy, you played at Madison High. When reports surfaced about you potentially coming back here, there was an outpouring on social media from a lot of San Diego high school coaches about how much they were happy to see that you're coming back. You know, how do you think, as a San Diego guy, maybe one of the few San Diego guys left on the staff, that you could parlay that into, you know, recruiting the top linemen here in San Diego?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that support from those guys. I think it took years to build those relationships with those guys. And I care about the game of football in San Diego. And I care about the high school product that we put out there. I'm still a San Diego high school football player. I take it personal, you know, and I love when guys have success coming out of San Diego. And the reason I have those relationships with those guys is because the willingness to work with them, the willingness to clinic and teach them some stuff that we might be doing at this level that can go help their high school programs. So those relationships were built over time. And I hope to use those connections. Coach Lewis gave me a big chunk of the San Diego area to recruit. But I hope that those relationships will pay off and we can keep the top local players here in San Diego, and not only keep them here in the recruiting time, but increase those resources and use the connections that we have here in the community to entice those guys to stay when other schools are coming after them. You know, the retention part of it is going to be huge. I really believe that if we have enough resources there and those guys in that offensive line room, if they feel like they're getting developed, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to leave.
I know we wanted to keep this interview more to an overarching philosophy, but I got to ask about Jonah Rodriguez. You know, it didn't initially click for me, the connection that you two might have had, until I was writing about Jonah, and I noticed he had an offer from Syracuse, and it kind of like dawned on me, okay, well, Mike Schmidt was at Syracuse then, and then I realized the Madison connection as well. You know, is that something, you obviously are on the East Coast, but you're recruiting one of the top offensive linemen in San Diego and almost getting him to go over there. You know, is that rapport with Jonah kind of something that could help him develop further?
Yeah, we recruited Jonah. We offered Jonah when he was a sophomore here. He was one of the best sophomore recruits in San Diego County, and we offered him. And then that was right around the time I took the job to Syracuse. So we threw an offer out. Nothing really materialized out there at Syracuse, you know. But So we never brought him on a trip or anything like that. Nothing materialized, but good to have him in the room, and look forward to enhancing his development.
Awesome. Well, Coach, it's great to have you back in San Diego and at San Diego State. We look forward to seeing how the team does through spring practice and on the spring game on April 20th.
I appreciate you guys. Thanks for everything you do for San Diego.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Have a good one.
All right.
All right, Paul, that was our conversation with Coach Mike Schmidt. Neither of us were covering the team, I believe, during Schmidt's first tenure.
Right.
So we never really had a chance to chat with him before. Now that he's back, we obviously got this chance to connect with him and get kind of an idea of his philosophy. You wrote the article that you can't go home again. Explain that one for people who may not have read the article yet, which you should after this episode if you haven't already. But explain what you meant by that statement and where you think Mike Schmidt can be a big part of this offensive turnaround.
Well, I think the genesis in my mind kind of started talking with Joe Borholm, the recruit from Arizona transfer who chose San Diego State, and he talked about that they watched film of the lines at San Diego State when Schmidt was here before, and how he believed that they're going to be able to kind of recapture that, and so that got me thinking about like, as great as that sounds, as wonderful as that sounds, as talking about, okay, he was here for 9 years, and then now this is year 10. It's not. There was a 3-year gap, and it turned out to also be the year that there was COVID, which changes, kind of everything. And so it just got me thinking about, like, how real is that? How real is the idea that he can just kind of come back? We saw, as we talked about in the interview, the outpouring of support from a lot of the high school coaches. So he obviously has a great reputation in San Diego. And it's not trying to say that like he's starting from scratch, but he is, in a sense, taking all of his past experiences and beginning anew. And so what I was trying to bring across in the article is that Mike Schmidt, a second time, has so much of a better resume than he did at any point the first time. I mean, obviously he starts because of Andy Ludwig's recommendation when he's 24. I was very grateful that, the University of Utah helped me to get a tremendous quote of just, somebody, one of the highest paid assistants, honestly thought that there would, if he wanted it, there could be like a good marriage for him to be the head coach here at San Diego State. He's very well thought of everywhere. And so Andy, is a mentor. We've heard that from Ryan Lindley. Now we hear it here. But you take all of those 9 years, and then you take 2 years in Syracuse where he's successful. You take him going from, taking over. Mike Leach obviously tragically passes away. They bring in Zach Arnett, and they're gonna have more of an identity of running the ball. And he's the one who like brings that about. And he's very successful at Mississippi State in the SEC. Those things all happen, and now you're sitting here, and you have somebody who is, and he explained this to us, who was married to Sean Lewis and is off as an offensive line coach, and we're talking about Coach O'Boyle. It sounded like that was in the works at Northwestern, and if it broke the way that it did, then he would be able to come back to San Diego. It kind of seemed to imply that. Which is a great thing, because I think all of us were like, why would O'Boyle take the job and then leave his buddy? Well, it sounded like it's like, look, here's what's going to happen. Either I'm going to get this job here, or I'll be with you. And I was just trying to say that all of those experiences make him better prepared to be the offensive line coach now than at any point. And so the thought of him just taking that continuity and bringing that over, you almost don't want it. You want the guy who was at Syracuse, who got a guy who was, a good freshman, but turned him into an All-American the next couple of years. Guy who's on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers practice squad. But it's not like this guy is a first-round pick. He was an undrafted free agent. I think he has 15 total career NFL carries. This is not a dude, and yet behind the lines that Mike Goff, who incidentally, one of the Syracuse guys just got drafted in the second round this year that Mike Schmidt worked with. And you want that experience. You want him in the SEC, figuring out what faster, bigger guys, all that stuff, and bringing all of that knowledge to Sean Lewis's offense that's similar to what he did at Syracuse. You don't want necessarily year 10 of Mike Schmidt. You want a brand new thing with all of these experiences. And I think that, and I tried to argue that those 3 years were so critical that you can't come home again. This is a brand new Mike Schmidt. This is a brand new, and I think there's potential to be even better.
Well, Tucker actually made the team as a backup running back coming out of preseason last year. Which is unheard of for an undrafted free agent that quickly. He struggled with some pass protection and things like that, so he ended up getting demoted and moving to practice squad. But he's a guy that has a lot of talent that you could see right away in preseason. There were two things that stood out to me when I re-listened to the interview, because remember, we did this interview maybe 6 weeks ago with Coach Schmidt, maybe even longer. One was he was very quick to point out accurately when I mentioned, hey, when you were gone, there were these linemen that made it to the NFL or made all conference, and but the running game wasn't good. And he's like, wait, most of those guys I recruited, and some of them I developed before I left.
Right.
Zach Thomas, BCD. He even mentioned Josh Simmons as a guy that he recruited here before he left. So I thought that was a cool correction on his part. The other one was, he was talking about how, as an offensive lineman, how he was talking about at Mississippi State, he kind of got a raw deal with Zach Arnett firing less than a year, and how he realized that you have to tie yourself with an offensive coach, because it's offensive coaches that get promoted the most, from coordinator to head coach, or from head coach at a G5 to a head coach at a Power 5, and how he wanted to be tied to an offensive guy because he's an offensive coach, and he thought his career progression was best that way. I thought that was an interesting response. Now, he said, I think Sean Lewis is his first offensive coach. You can make the case his year or 2 years at Syracuse, Dino Babers is offensive, but I don't know how he was looking at it from that perspective. But it is mostly because at San Diego State, it was Rocky Long. And then, Zach Arnett and things like that. So interesting conversation, and he's got a difficult job ahead of him, but I like what they've done. I like who they've gotten since the spring ended. They've got obviously 2 starters from last year who didn't perform in spring due to injuries, who should be coming back, working their way back. So he's got the talent, and we'll see what materializes. You're on mute.
It's always interesting to hear, how Mike's a big dude, right? Maybe not to you, but he's a big guy. I saw him a couple of weeks ago, last week, at Granite Hills, and he was kind enough to answer a couple of questions for an article, and it was funny, he has this persona. He's loud. He is passionate. At the coaches clinic, he started off for the offensive staff, and in like the breakout sessions, and he's passionate. He's getting after it, and I'm telling you, man, every coach in there wanted to run through a wall, for him and with what he was doing, and yet when Coach Lewis described him, he described him as somebody who loves on his guys hard. And I thought that, that was an interesting thing. And then he talked about, how great it was to come home and to set up his kids, his 2 kids for being in San Diego and being able to do that. And, I think that as much as he sounds like, he looks like, he comes from that Brady Hoke, a Rocky Long, hard-nosed kind of guy. I think what makes him so loved by everyone else is his compassion, the fact that he cares, the fact that he values people, And so I thought that contrast was neat. I thought that was an interesting contrast, and that really stood out to me. And then I think the last part of our conversation and that I enjoyed is, I love the way he talked about the kinds of offensive linemen that he's looking for. And I liked how he talked about his progression as a young coach and wanting to get organized and then coming with that framework of his 4Fs as a way for his own thoughts to be gathered. The thing that I think comes across most from him is how specific his responses are, and how insightful they are. And he doesn't, unlike a lot of coaches, he doesn't speak in generalities. He speaks in the specifics of what it is that he wants. And I think that kind of specificity, I think it inspires confidence. And so I think that, they've done a lot, and I think it sounds like, they're not lucky to have landed him, but that they went and had a plan A and a plan, plan B or a plan AA, whatever, to begin with. But it's a coup, man. It sounded like it's pretty remarkable that they got him to be able to come back and do the job.
I'm curious myself, and hopefully during fall camp, we get to attend some practices to see how his approach to coaching offensive line is different than Mike Goff. Like, Mike Goff was a 10-year NFL veteran. I think he made a Pro Bowl or a couple Pro Bowls. Like, he was a really good offensive lineman. And, doesn't necessarily mean every great player is going to translate to a great coach. But when we talked to Mike Goff, he spoke the language, right? And I'm curious, but we didn't see the results necessarily as an overall unit and an overall running game. But I'm just curious to see how Coach Schmidt, who has more experience coaching at the D1 level, how his approach is different and how those results, improve, get worse or stay the same, whatever. So that's something I want to look at in fall camp and see how the approach is different, because I'm just curious. Every coach has a different philosophy, right? But at the end of the day, if you're coaching a position, there's certain things every coach needs to get their guys to do, which is similar across the board. And I just wonder where those nuances are that we may or may not even be able to see when we're out there.
Absolutely. And it's a very results oriented game, and there's just been glaring weaknesses on the offensive lines for 2 straight years. I think the first year that Mike Goff was here, I thought that line was great. And they dominated a very good defensive front in Utah, and we all know obviously most wins in school history. So I don't want to paint the idea. They did average 4 yards a carry. It wasn't like, I think it was 2019 with Mike Schmidt here. They averaged 3.4. So I mean, there's been worse. But at the same time, with the procedure penalties 2 years ago, and just the shuffling that had to take place multiple times in multiple years, and not really being able to fully bring, I think, guys like Joey Wright or people along that they were really counting on and needed to produce, and it just didn't happen. I think that if this line is better, even if it's probably not completely apples and apples, right? I mean, if you have more of a ball control, bunched formation kind of stuff, maybe it's a little bit different how you're able to block things versus if you're able to get numbers and do all of that kind of stuff. Although with Jeff Hicklinski, they obviously were trying to do similar things there without the tempo. So I agree. I think that is one of the fascinating things. And, I always go back to the idea of, I think there were signs of positive things at Mississippi State, but they were 5-7. They got fired. That doesn't mean Mike Schmidt is a bad coach. Same thing with Mike Goff. There may have been other things that made it be what it was. You know, I mean, for no other reason than the transfer portal popping up. I mean, what does Josh Simmons look like not starting at left tackle for Ohio State, where and he would have been for every other year of college football. He's at San Diego State for that second year, as after, you know, taking all those lumps as a freshman. I mean, how much better does his line look without the terrible, you know, tragedy with Xavier Leonard, who I think would have started ahead of Josh Simmons, if not for all of the rape allegations and all of those things. You know, what does his line look like? And these are things that are obviously out of his control. But the way that they were, you know, running Leonard, he was one of their top 5 guys, and that we saw in practice. And so I think there's all of those what ifs that are about it, but at the end of the day, what matters is results. And the bottom line is San Diego State has not been able, since Greg Bell left, to run the ball with any sort of consistency, with any sort of authority, to put fear in opposing defenses. And that's allowed them to put numbers up front, but it's also allowed them to gamble more and to not have to respect that you're going to have to bottle these guys up because, man, they're going to take it to the house. And so, you know, if that offensive line is able to do something better, you know, this is, I think, one of the 2 areas that I would circle right now in May is like, where can San Diego State improve? And where they can improve is running the football and tackling ball carriers. And if they can do those 2 things, that alone, even if they've had maybe a little bit of an overall talent drain, should make them better than they were last year, because no team can win when you can't tackle. It doesn't matter how good you are if you can't bring people to the turf. And then if you want to kind of make up for whatever there may be potential spots where you're not as strong as you were the year before, maybe if you run the ball, all of a sudden those holes don't look as big and as glaring.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of holes, you know, moving on to the transfer portal.
Yeah.
You know, there was a group of players who entered the portal after spring, opened up a lot of spots. After that, they had 10 open scholarships. San Diego State did. One of those went to Gabriel Placencia for winning the kicking competition in the spring.
That's
But
good.
they had 9 spots, 9 scholarships, and they've got 8 commitments, and 6 of those are from the offensive and defensive lines, places that Sean Lewis said after the spring game, those are the primary areas, the trenches. No surprise there. I want to quickly, not to go through detailed each, but like if you've written a lot of articles about most of these guys.
Yeah.
If you look at offense, you got 2 offensive linemen, Joe Borjan, who you mentioned, and Nicholas Green, guys who are predominantly tackles, who we talked about in a prior episode. They may be looking for competition for Christian Jones at left tackle. So those guys could step in there, and you know, obviously going off of the Mike Schmidt conversation, 2 more talented guys that he's got in the fold to help that competition. But the guy that really intrigues me on the offensive side is Marquez Cooper, running back.
Yeah.
We talked all spring about how they didn't bring in a running back when the coaching staff took over. Nobody left from last year's team, and how that running group was, you know, pretty stable, right? But then, you know, Martin Blake, Sheldon Canley, they transfer out, and then you got this Marquez Cooper coming in, who, by your article, you mentioned he's the leading active rusher in Division I, or is NCAA.
NCAA, yep.
Yeah. 3,000-yard rusher, played under Sean Lewis at Kent State. Like, it's hard for me to envision that he's not the starting running back, or at least 1 or 2 by the time August 31st comes around against Texas A&M Commerce. Do you see it the same way?
I do. I mean, I do. I mean, it's challenging when you have a guy who has production. I want to say super clearly, and you know, Marquez said this too. Like, he wasn't handed that job.
Right.
It's just when you look at a guy who's had 3,000-yard seasons, and he's done those in Sean Lewis's offense, the other guys better be better. I mean, that's just it. They better be better, and they better be good. And so I think that I think he would have to be the favorite. And I think that if you look at the history of the backs who were there, obviously, Keenan Christian, Jalen Armstead, they didn't lock down the position last year, even though they were handed it at the beginning of the year. And both of them had flashes at different points. But some of those, they had to earn that stuff back from the backs who were under them. The year before that, it was the same kind of thing. Like here we go. Like this is going to be Jalen Armstead's year. He's finally an upperclassman, those kinds of things, or third year in the program. And it was Jordan Byrd who got all of the carries, even though everyone was saying man, maybe this guy should be a receiver, right? And obviously that's what, when he tried for the NFL, that's what he went and did. And so you fast forward and, you go back to 2022, the last time that Sean Lewis was a head coach at Kent State. And, Marcus Cooper had a net of 1,331 yards. He was their leading rusher, right? 285 attempts. Now they had other guys, but the next closest guy had under 500. And you look at the receiving core. And Dante Cephas, who would have been a big pickup, but they weren't able to get him in the transfer portal. But their third leading receiver in 2022 is Jay-Sean Polk.
Jay-Sean Polk, yeah.
And here he is in San Diego. And so it's we kind of said, I talked about with the offensive line, would O'Boyle bring some of those guys who were transferring, bring them to San Diego? Well, he didn't get that chance because he left. Okay. But Sean Lewis brought his offensive weapons with him. He brought the third leading receiver, a guy who has proof in his offense, a guy who averaged, almost 12 yards of reception from that slot position. He brought his running back with him. And that's what you would want, right? I mean, and so I think he is incredibly intriguing. He's incredibly intriguing. And I think that, the running backs all have potential. We've all seen it, but they have not been able to put it together consistently. And as I said, and we've talked about, if somebody beats him out, this is going to be a really good year for the Aztecs. I think of all of their guys that they brought in the transfer portal, and I'm talking about period, all of their guys, he's the one guy who I think has the most proven production that you're like, okay, that guy makes the Aztecs better. Not, well, let's hope he rounds into shape. Let's hope AJ Duffy can be the Florida State guy, or let's hope he can be that really good quarterback where it's this is a guy who's proven it. And so I agree with you. I think it's a really, really intriguing.
Yeah, I would say the only competition in terms of the most proven would be Jay-Sean Polk, because so many years. But Cooper obviously would be ahead of that because of the rushing yardage. On the defensive side, if you look at the non-defensive lineman guys, Kyle Moretti, he's an off-ball linebacker from Central Michigan. San Diego State actually plays at Central Michigan in week 4 or 5 this year. He's an all-MAC performer. Pretty good. He's another guy who has some pretty good production himself. To go with that linebacker group has completely changed. Outside of Cody Moon and Brady Anderson, everybody else is pretty new.
Yeah.
DJ Herman, I think, is still there.
Special teams guy though. He wasn't.
Yeah.
Didn't figure.
But I mean, between Latuli, Chambliss, now Moretti, to go with Moon and Brady Anderson, seem like they're the five top linebackers that are going to battle it out. And I think it'll be a pretty good competition now that there's only 2 linebackers on the field at a time, to see what those guys do. Anything on him that stood out to you before we talk about the defense line?
Moretti, I obviously, you're I think he was a 2-time all MAC
Mhm.
guys, but both of them were third team selections. And so, you know, that's always an interesting thing. I think you look at some of his tweets and he's tweeting about, you know, being able to have like, he had Power 5 aspirations, I think, on some of those things, and fell short of that a little bit with coming to San Diego State. I think the part of it that I'm most interested in about that whole position is, you know, there was a coaching caravan that was in San Diego, was in Chula Vista this evening, you know, 15 minutes from my house. So I took my sons and we went and listened to Brian Dutcher and Sean Lewis, and had a good time there. And one of the things that he talked about was that they want both linebackers to be able to be fast and physical and fly sideline to sideline. And that description is a little bit different than what the 4-2-5 linebacker descriptions have been. And we've talked about this. We don't know what Coach Schmidt's kind of wrinkle to that is going to be until like we see it. And so I thought that was an interesting description, that there may not be as big of a difference in you know, high Power 5 groups. That middle linebacker is kind of that thud guy, space eating kind of guy who's going to go plug in those holes and stuff like that. And those guys are hard to get. Like everybody wants, you know, the 6'3", 235, 240-pound guy who can run, and you know what I mean? Like that's what everybody wants. And maybe those guys aren't going to come to San Diego State. So is there a way to build your defense where the kinds of athletes who are still great athletes, but like will actually come to San Diego State? Like, can you build your defense that way? Which is, of course, what the 3-3-5 was all about. But 3-3-5 was all about getting kind of tweeners, getting whatever, but letting them find a home, right? Like Cyrus Fiaseu, like perfect example, phenomenal football player who people are not going to know what to do with at other levels of football, you know? And I thought that was interesting. So I don't know how it's going to break. I really don't. Because if knowing how it traditionally is, I would have said you're going to have, and it's kind of how they ran it in practice, right? You had Latui and Herman as like the two guys who were that a little bit more physical, and then you saw Moon and Chambliss and Anderson on the other one. But man, I would love to see if they're going to actually mix and match that, and if you could get like the speed of Anderson and Moon at the same time, or the speed of Anderson and Chambliss, or you know, what those will look like, and if they will play a little bit of those faster guys, or you know, if it's you know, if they have like the third down sub packages or any of those kinds of things. But you know, Coach Lewis definitely hinted that these things could be a little bit different than maybe what the traditional 4-2-5, you know, if you watch a YouTube video, what they're going to say, like the personnel looks like.
Yeah, when we had Coach Eric Schmidt on, I think the only position we didn't ask him about was linebacker, which he's the linebacker
the coach,
coach.
the one he's a position coach for.
Yeah.
Good job, Les. Well done. That's some great interviewing. Yes.
Moving to the defensive line, which I think everyone can agree was probably the biggest spot looking to address.
Yeah.
They've gotten 2 edge guys and 2 interior linemen. Ezekiel Larry from Yale, who's an edge guy, you wrote about him before he had committed,
Right,
as someone that was had an offer. And then Jared Beatty from Illinois kind of
Yep.
popped out of nowhere.
You did.
He's interesting. When I went back and looked at some of the notes on him, you know, he was an edge guy.
Mhm.
They moved into inside linebacker at the beginning of spring because they had some injuries and some depth issues inside. And then by the end of spring, he's playing tight end. So who knows what the staff was looking there, but you can kind of see the writing on the wall that he was going to look to
Right.
go elsewhere.
Right.
And he wants to play edge. I think he's going to play edge here at State. And then Krishna Clay and Samuel and Benjamin are more guys who probably interior guys. Help me out. Where is Clay from? Do you remember that? I know Benjamin is Arizona State, but I can't remember.
JC guy, yeah?
Is he a JC guy? Yeah. So yeah, those are four talented guys that hopefully will help shore up some of the edge and interior line deficiencies, because I think that was a spot that they're looking to upgrade. As you can see, a lot of guys from the defensive line transferred out. That were, third, fourth team on the depth chart, and they're looking to bring these guys in to help them be, first, second team guys, at least at some point during their state career. So, anything that stands out on those four guys to you?
Well, just the same nugget that Coach Lewis from the Caravan talked about tonight. We've been talking about that there's traditionally a true nose tackle.
Hmm.
And obviously Brandon McElroy, who they brought in, fit that description, right? And Coach Lewis said tonight that what they're looking for is both guys on the line to be able to be penetrators and not just guys who control gaps. And once again, it seems like those kind of guys grow on trees for a program like San Diego State. Guys who can fit what would be that other nose tackle, right? The guy who would be playing nose tackle or maybe end in the 3-3-5. And I don't know if that's just them going and saying, hey, this year we're not going to have that, so we gotta build our recipe with the ingredients that we have, or if that will always be the case. But again, a 330-pound guy who is also athletic enough to be able to move a little bit, they're very coveted as well. And if San Diego State can figure out a way to build their defense where they can get those guys like, who are either short, like their incoming freshman Cornelius who's coming in, or guys who are like Tupu Alualu, or all the guys that you just named. And the Coach Lewis talked tonight that they have one scholarship left, and they said that if they, are able to seal the deal with one of, it's going to be another defensive lineman. Rumors about a defensive lineman from USC being in town and things like that. So he definitely did say that it could be it's a defensive line guy if they're able to hold him. And so it just completely adds to that mix. I thought that they brought in youth, they've brought in for coming years for development. They've also brought in guys that you would think would be immediate pass rushers or immediate impact guys. I think after the spring game, we asked, Coach Lewis how many edge rushers he wants, and he said 4 to 6. And we through our observation said they had 3, right? We said they had Trey White, Dominic Oliver, and Harlan Lewis, who Jonathan Oliveri, he wrote a great article about him. And we said, from our eyes, they got 3. And then you started to see the guys who would be 4, 5, and 6, and they all transferred out, right? And then in their place, there were the guys that you mentioned, and now it looks like they might have 6. It's just, it'll be really interesting to see how all of that unfolds and how they're able to build and to match those. But my overall feeling about what they did is they checked every box. Now, the question is, are these guys quality, right? We've already talked about Brandon McElroy. Well, who recruited Brandon McElroy who wasn't good enough to be able to keep his spot after just one spring? You know what I mean? Obviously, he's a 1-year guy, so this is not like, I think, it's not a surprise if either you cut it or you don't. Well, it's the same staff who's recruiting all of these guys. You do check the boxes. And now you do have offensive line guys who were coveted by other programs that are in the Power 5, who had all sorts of opportunities to play elsewhere. Okay, cool. So now you have that depth, but are they good? And that's what time will tell. The same thing with all of these guys, like as exciting as a guy like Ezekiel Arias, and as much as I enjoyed interviewing him multiple times and all those kinds of things, like he's playing at an FCS level where nobody has a scholarship. And that matters, right? Or it doesn't, and he's just going to be really good. Obviously, bloodlines and all those kinds of things. So I think that they look better on paper. And every place that you would at the spring game, and you're like, they better address that. They better address that. Their own words about who they wanted to bring in. They succeeded in addressing those positions. But it's kind of like the NFL draft, just because you get guys from that position and you've addressed your weakness doesn't mean that those are players. And that's what's going to make or break, I think, this team, is whether or not the guys that they brought in can actually play, can actually produce at this level for San Diego State, in Sean Lewis, in Coach Schmidt's defense, that can they actually do it? And I don't know if you saw the quote by Dabo Sweeney today, where he famously has not gotten anybody in the transfer portal, and people are like, well, what's up with that? And he didn't make this like high-minded declaration of just like, well, we want to be. He goes, listen, the guys who are in the transfer portal are not good enough to play at Clemson. And those are facts. That is absolutely true. That the people at Clemson's level are people who are circulating from Ohio State and from Alabama, and they're all kind of trading players with each other. There's no promise or guarantee that the guys at San Diego State got in the transfer portal are going to be the quality that are needed to be able to win football games. Now, that's their job over the summer, is to make that turn about. And you're sitting here in May, and again, Marquez Cooper is the one guy that you would go and you would say, that's an FBS running back who's had good success at the FBS level, has had good success in Sean Lewis's offense. It would be a barring injury or somebody else taking carries from him, it would be really surprising if this guy does not rush for 1,000 yards. Everybody else, I mean, you tell me, what are you getting from Ezekiel Laird? You know what I mean? What are you getting? I don't know. I mean, we saw Cody Moon be all world at New Mexico. Same lateral move in terms of the conference. And, he had flashes of being good, but he was not the guy that everyone thought. And, he was less athletic than they thought at the beginning. And, he looks bigger. He looks like all the things that they have been wanting Cody Moon to do. He looks all of those things in practice. And so I honestly think that he's going to have a really big year. But he didn't have the immediate impact that you would have predicted that he would have. And so, it wouldn't shock me, would not shock me at all if, we talk about the offensive line, if the 5 starters who were the 5 starters in spring, that none of those guys are better than Christian Jones that they got, and Christian Jones is just going to be the starter. And that's just, he's going to be good enough, or they're not going to be good enough to be able to push him. They're going to be trying to push him. They're bringing that competition, but that wouldn't shock me in the least. And those guys are just depth pieces. There for Williams after he retires and after he has to move on from eligibility, and they're there. Same thing with these defensive line. Those 3 edge rushers that we named as being their top guys would not shock me if they're their top guys, and the other guys are just guys who are kind of getting the leftover of the the things that are there. Defensive tackle, same thing. If we're sitting there and it's Brady Nasser and Ryan Henderson and Tupu Alualu, and those are their guys, and these other 2 guys that they got from the JC and the things over, and they're just depth pieces, guys that they're bringing for the next years and things like that, would not be surprising in the least.
The Krishna Clay is from the College of San Mateo.
There it is.
And then the USC guy you mentioned, his name is Stanley Taufo.
I wasn't gonna do it.
I'm just pronouncing it just like it's spelled. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's the guy who came in, and we'll see if he ends up being the guy that Sean Lewis was alluding to. But definitely they focused and put a high premium on defensive line guys.
That guy has some proven production. He
Yeah.
started some games. He started some games. That
And he's got 1 year left. He's a graduate, so he's got, I believe, 1 year left. What was the format of the coaches' caravan? Like, did each coach come up separately, and then the crowd got to ask questions, or were they all up there at the same time and you can hit any coach you wanted with questions?
So the format was our good buddy John Schaefer was the MC. And he introduced first Brian Dutcher. Coach Dutcher gave his spiel, then Coach Lewis gave his spiel, and then people just were able to ask questions to either one of them.
Got it. And it was $10 entrance?
It was $10 entrance, yeah. And it was the area that was set aside for that was full. And I think both of them that they're both the people in the audience and both coaches volunteered to talk about NIL and all of the things that are part of it. And both of them said that you guys all have businesses, and if the government gives you new regulations and new things that you got to work with, you don't go out of business. You adapt and you figure it out. And NIL is what we need to do and is what we need to figure out, and it's a piece and a component of who we are. And I thought the honesty that both of them had, I thought was outstanding. Maybe they, knowing that I was not writing an article, they talk a little freer, and but I thought that I think Dutcher's message is funny because you have somebody who's not even maybe he's just approaching 6 months in the job, and then you have somebody else who's approaching 2 decades. And just their approaches were just different. Dutcher, he said, basically, stop worrying about all the guys leaving. Stop worrying about what everyone's saying. Let me tell you something. We're going to be good. And he kind of said, basically, trust me. I know what I'm doing. You know who I am. You know our relationship. Stop worrying about all of it. We're going to be really good. We're going to go hang banners in the Mountain West. This is what we're going to do. We got the guys that we got coming in. We got to build a team. It's just like always, we're going to be really good. And then Sean Lewis, he's in that, everybody's in that wait and see approach. Everybody is. So tell me about the quarterbacks, and it's the same kind of thing. Wide receivers. Tell about the wide receivers. He did, and with his response to wide receivers, he named 4 wide receivers. Which 4 did he name?
Jay Sean Polk, Nate Bennett.
That was did not mention Nate Bennett.
Lewis Brown.
Lewis Brown, that's 2.
Mekhi Shaw.
Kai Shaw was the first person to tell me about the wide receivers, and he said he's a savvy vet. He will do everything that we want him to do. A lot of praise for Mekhi Shaw.
So Shaw, Brown.
This one will probably be the most exciting to anybody who's listening.
Baylon Brooks?
Yes, sir. Yep. Baylon Brooks was the second person that he talked about. He talked about him flashing last year on tape and how, he's so I thought that was interesting. Those were the 4 receivers that he talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you also have Jerry McClure probably waiting in the wings there. Philippe Wesley, we didn't see much of him this spring. He kind of seems to have been pushed down a little bit down the pecking order with so many guys brought in, but he's a guy we saw in the fall step up.
Completely.
And then an injury kind of derailed the start of a season, and he never got it back on track. But yeah, those 3 incoming freshmen that are going to be probably
he
coming
did mention them
campus,
as a group. Yep.
Those guys are, I mean, seeing Freeney's just his basketball highlights and dunks, the athleticism, and then McCree and Scolari, like those, it's a talented group of wide receivers on this roster in the fall. A lot of guys who probably could deserve to play are not going to get to play and not get snaps because so many guys ahead of them.
I agree. And again, though, it's and I don't want to be beating the dead horse on it, but every one of those guys, even Jason Polk, who has had some, he didn't play at West Virginia after transferring over there. So he hasn't had production since Kent State. It's always about, well, these guys could be good. You know what I mean? I think Mekhi Shaw is the closest thing to a sure thing that they have in that wide receiver group. And he would be the person that I would expect to be the most consistent guy, just because he's been that guy. He's done those things. I think his athleticism is underrated. His speed, I think, is underrated, just because of his size and the fact that he's, he always seems to be making those tough catches. I think sometimes it makes people feel like he can't separate. But I also think some of that's just the timing routes, the fact that he didn't have that he was never playing with the strongest arm quarterback. Those things kind of do that as well. But I've always been, obviously they're using him as a punt returner for a reason. It wasn't just because he can catch the ball, it's because they thought he could do something with the ball in his hands. Obviously had the big long reception against Hawaii, to kind of get that gap back in that game. And so I think that he's the most proven. But that's the issue with this team, is that, usually for most teams, you go and you say, okay, well, you may not be proven here, but you have like these other three positions where you're like, man, you feel really, really good. But I mean, I think you go through every single position now, with the exception of running back, and you say, there is no great proven production here. I don't think you feel great with the offensive line. Nate Williams, I think, is the guy you feel the best with. Yeah, they like Braden Bryant at center. They like him. Yep, but he's coming from the FCS. He's got to step up in that competition and prove that he's able to do that on a consistent basis. Tight end, yep, Jude Wolf looks like he's the guy who was the 5-star guy and all that stuff. And yeah, you have Logan Tanner behind him who's looking pretty good. But I don't know. Again, it's unproven. And you just go quarterback, all these positions, the same thing over and over again. You have guys who you hope for. And, generally in football, you might get two guys that you're really counting on who like really step into it and become like studs. And they're going to need, a half dozen or so if they're going to be competing for a conference championship. Doesn't mean they can't do it, but that's usually not the recipe. Or maybe I should probably say better, that used to, before NIL and the transfer portal, not be the way that you would go about building your team. But that's maybe the common thing. Last thing that I wanted to mention, because we were talking about the tight end, they actually had a tight end who came and visited, Connor Gilbreth, from LSU. He first was at Butte College before going to LSU. He is a phenomenal blocker as a blocking tight end. And if they had designs and ideas of maybe making him a tackle or something like that. But he ends up committing to Boise State. And he told me basically that the reason he's not at San Diego State is because they offered him a preferred walk-on, and the financials would not work because they only have one scholarship, as Coach Lewis said tonight. That's for a defensive lineman. It's one of those things that keep an eye out on him, because he's a guy who visited San Diego. And I think they would have given Boise State a run for their money if they had him and had offered him a scholarship. But down the road, he is an all Mountain West tackle and all Mountain West tight end. However he ends up developing, he could be one that legitimately got away because they ran out of scholarships.
Yeah, I saw that he visited, but as you said, one scholarship left. It's you could see right now players can't enter the portal anymore.
Right.
So, but as we've seen in the past, you could have players just decide to retire from football, either due to medical reasons or not wanting. So, I mean, there's a potential that extra scholarship spots could open up as the season gets closer if someone just decides to leave the team, but that's probably unlikely. So that last scholarship is really their last opportunity to add another player in a position of need. And as Coach Lewis said, defensive line is where they're looking at it. All right, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the interview with Coach Mike Schmidt. We're nearing the end of our coaches series. We've got one left with Ryan Lindley that'll be out in the near future. But I believe this was number 8 out of 9 that we've done. So really happy with what we were able to do with that coaches series, and we obviously also talked to the head coach Sean Lewis in addition to that, and mixed in there. As always, we appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening, liking, sharing, following, subscribing on all your favorite platforms, and we'll talk to you guys next time. You are listening to the SDSU podcast presented by the East Village Times with your hosts Andre Hagverdian and Paul Garrison.